Welcome to Tech Notice. It's time to talk about this PC over here, because you can't see it on this angle, only just tiny little bit. From this you can see the whole thing. The build is complete. It's time to talk about the benchmarks and answer the main question. Would this rig be good for video editing and for creators? So let's find out. We're going to go into a buttload of benchmarks in a moment, but I just want to say that all these parts that I'm using are linked in the description below if you want to check out the exact parts or what spec and blah blah blah. But I just want to mention the main specs. The GPU is RTX 3090, like the best one you can get on the market right now. Then the CPU is Ryzen 5800X. It's Ryzen 7. It's an 8-core, 16-thread processor. Pretty good. Now, there is also 32 gigabytes of RAM at 3600 megahertz. And then the rest of the parts you can find in the description below. And also, the world's fastest SSD is inside there as well. So, let's go through some of the benchmarks, and then we're going to go into Premiere Pro benchmarks in the end, which I've done with some of the other builds, like the Owl build and my personal break. So, if you've been familiar with these builds, you're going to see this compared to that one as well. But let's start with the Cinebench R23. Now, the single core is 1582 points, as you can see, which is a good 200 points over Ryzen 3950X, which I'm running currently myself, and this other PC behind there, which is the 10900K. So very impressive single core speeds. Now, what about the multi-core? The multi-core score on Cinebench R23 is 15,207 points, which is very close to our 10-core 10900K at 16,220 points. Now, it's not as good as the Ryzen 3950X with 16 cores. Let's move on to Geekbench 5 CPU scores. Now, for the CPU scores, we have 1,696, which is almost 1,700, and it is another good few hundred points better than our 10900K and 3950X Ryzens. But the interesting thing is, now on the Geekbench, we are scoring higher than Intel 10900K. The best benchmark I got was 9,935, whereas the 5800X over here is 10,492. Very interesting. So obviously the Ryzen 9 3950X scores better on the multi-score, so we'll leave that over there. Next up, let's move on to the CUDA, OpenCL and Vulkan scores on Geekbench 5. And now we have three graphics cards. My personal rig has the 2060 Super, then our Owl build 10900K has 3070, and this one over here is 3090. So I'm just going to point out the 3090 scores, and then you can see on the screens the comparison between 3070 and 2060. So the CUDA score for 3090, we have 250,997, which is another 100,000 points better than 3070. Then our OpenCL score is 216,217, which is still quite a bit better than the 3070. And then our Vulkan score on the 1390 is 178,717. Now let's move on to the Blender CPU tests. In here we're going to compare two of them, but on the screen you're going to see all of them, but I'm just going to read out the BMW and Victor scores. So on the CPU of this 5800X, we can see that BMW is 2 minutes 48 seconds, which is 13 seconds slower than the 10900K. And on the Victor render, we have 12 minutes and 9 seconds compared to the 10900K, which has 12 minutes and 53 seconds. So which is interesting, because the slower render is faster on the 10900K, but the longer render is faster on this 5800X. Now, I bet this is because the Intel's boost clock times of the multi all-core boost is gonna slow down later on. That's why on the longer render, it's gonna pull down the boost clocks, and then we're getting a slower render speeds over there. Our 3950X is faster on both of the instances. But in terms of GPU rendering now on Blender, and doing that on the CUDA, we can see that our 1390 over here did the BMW render in 19 seconds. Which is almost twice as fast as the 3070. The 3070 did it in 34 seconds, which is quite interesting. And compared to the 2060 Super, which is 1 minute 6 seconds, over 3 times faster. On the Victor render there, we are finishing the Victor render at 3 minutes and 0 seconds compared to the 3070, which is 5 minutes and 4 seconds, which is, you know, I don't know, 50% faster. Not quite double the speed, but we are doing it more than 3 times faster compared to the 2060 Super. So if you're wanting the rendering speeds, obviously 3090 is an absolute monster. Let's look at the SSD speed tests. So we have a few SSDs on these systems. So this one over here is running Cinebench Rocket 4.0 Plus, which is ridiculously fast speeds, as you can see in a moment. Then the 10900K is only limited to PCIe 3.0 speeds. And then my Ryzen 3950X runs the Cinebench Rocket 4.0 speeds. So it'd be interesting to see how much the 4.0 Plus is faster on this one. And I'm going to start with this 3090 or 5800X build over here. The read speed is 6,947 megabytes per second. Megabytes. That is 7 gigabytes per second. Almost 7 gigabytes per second read speed. That is ridiculous. Now the write speed is 5.2 gigabytes per second read speed. It's insane. 5,258 megabytes per second. It's ridiculous. And then compared to the 4.0 over there, the read speed is 4,884 and write speed 4,277. So quite a few gigabytes better speeds over here. And then the 10900K has the best SSD over there with it, which is Cardia 0Z340, and that is 3,359 megabytes per second read speed and 2,973 megabytes per second write speed. Very impressive, but not quite as impressive as 7 gigabytes per second, which is literally double the speed of 3.0 PCIe drives. And finally, we have arrived to the Premiere Pro benchmark of this system. Obviously, this GPU is quite good. There is some better ones like Ryzen 9s, and the GPU is like the best you can get there. But this combination of all of this, how good is it when doing editing or video editing in specific? You're going to find out, and then I'm going to give you a very interesting conclusion if you should be getting this or not. So I was testing quite a few like playback speed tests. So how does it play back certain codecs of video? So the 4K 422 10-bit codec that comes from the Sony a7S III that you are looking through right now, all of their systems drop 0 frames. On the Red Raw 4K, it is pretty much the same, although the Ryzen 3950X sometimes drops a few frames, so we're gonna give the win to 10900K and this 5800K. Next up, we have the B-Raw 6K playback. We drop in 0 frames. B-Raw 6K 2 times playback, so 2 6Ks on top of each other, and then playing them back, 0 frames dropped as well. But 6K 3 times playback speed, we have 35 frames dropped on the 10900K, 38 frames dropped on the 3950X, and 31 frames dropped on this system. And obviously this system gets the win, but we're only playing there like 4 and 5 frames on this, but it still makes a difference. This one plays it back the best. Now, moving on to Red Raw 8K, the Ryzen 3950X 16 core drops 0 frames, and looks like if you're editing Red 8K, you need a lot of threads and a lot of cores to play back that footage, because the 10900K drops 61 frames, and then this one over here, which is 8 core, the lowest of the cores, drops 75 frames. So the more frames you drop, the worse, obviously. Also testing Blackmagic Raw 12K footage. We have 420 frames dropped on the Intel 10900K, which is the best core out of the bunch. Ryzen 3950X drops 451, so another 30 frames, and then this one drops even more at 470 frames. Having a sequence, a 2-minute sequence where there's all of these clips that I just talked about, put in there together, resized, you know, put on top of each other, plus color grades and things like that. So that should be testing the playback of GPU and CPU, because some of the effects are accelerated through the GPU, and then seeing how well does it play back. Now that's interesting that both of the Intel 10900K or the OWL system and my personal rig with 3950X drop 0 frames, but this 5800X drops 54 frames. Now I also want to mention that both of the other systems are running 64 gigabytes of RAM, whereas this one is 32 gigabytes of RAM, and I can see that this system is capped, or it's capping the system with 32 gigabytes of RAM, which shows us or tells us that if you're running Premiere Pro and you're running quite high codec 6K, 8K and raw codecs, and you want to play back or do exports, you might want to get 64 gigabytes minimum of RAM or even more, just to like make the playback smoother and export times faster. Now doing the same 2-minute export time and exporting it into a YouTube setting, which is H.264 4K with 40 megabits per second bitrate, and using the hardware acceleration, because the GPU can accelerate this, and not all of these codecs can be accelerated, but it's a very difficult, you know, task for the GPU basically and CPU at the same time. The fastest of the bunch is the Ryzen 3950X with the lowest GPU actually, 1 minute 14 seconds. Then the 10900K is 1 minute 21 seconds, and then our 5800X with the 1390 comes in at 2 minutes and 52 seconds. Now I did the test with Studio Driver as well as Game Ready Driver, and the difference wasn't that big. The Studio Driver was only 3 seconds faster, but it could be the, you know, error of the test as well. When moving on to just VBR2 pass, which is only software acceleration only or software rendering, and it can't use the GPU anymore, we can see that the fastest of the bunch is still the Ryzen 3950X. Then comes Intel 10900K, and then like miles later, like 3 minutes later, almost double the time, comes this 5800X system. And here's the conclusion. Would this system be good for editing or not, especially on Premiere Pro and DaVinci Resolve included as well? Now, running these benchmarks is one thing, but doing day-to-day editing on this is a different one. And as we can see a little bit on the VBR2 pass, where the GPU and the CPU and the rendering test where they're more used, you can see that this is not a very good system because it's much more expensive than both of the other systems we're comparing it to, but the editing performance isn't as good. And here's 2 reasons why. First of all, Premiere Pro likes to use more threads and cores and things like that. Even though this is fantastic single core performance, Premiere Pro still likes to use the multi-cores even more. Second of all, this Ryzen 5800X runs super hot, like weirdly hot. And even with the best cooling that you can get, it still runs very hot, which means it is actually just thermal throttling itself down a little bit, which means the performance isn't as good as just running a quick benchmark on it. And you know, time to time when you're using it day to day, things like that, it gets hot, so your fans are loud and your CPU goes slightly slower. So would this system be good for editing, video editing? I wouldn't say so. There's few things that I would improve. I would put more RAM in if you want to do some serious editing, get a different CPU in there, either Ryzen 9 5900X or Ryzen 3900X if you want to save some money, or Ryzen 5950X processors. I'm going to leave these in the description below, and if you haven't seen my video, which is the best CPU for Premiere Pro usage and what would be the best bang for buck upgrade path, then please check it out. It's absolutely amazing video. It's kind of hard to recommend this very specific system for photographers, even though the CPU would be one of the best ones you could get for photos. That means if it's active tasks. But the GPU is just so overkill that makes this system very much expensive. So that's that. Now, if you're doing gaming in the bunch, obviously this is completely another story, because this system is actually meant for that. And the person who built this is doing gaming on Call of Duty Warfare, and this is literally made for that. And that's why we didn't go with Intel 10900K, for example, because the 5800X is cheaper and runs the same frame rates, plus is a little bit cheaper, and that's why this system. In terms of creative perspective, this is not the best bang for buck system for you, but it looks good and it's very powerful in some GPU heavy rendering if you want to do that. Anyway, a lot of talk. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks guys for watching. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. Let me know which build would you like to see next, and I'll see you next time. Thanks guys for watching. Bye bye.